go. All right, so I think we should be on the presentation mode right here. Everybody's seeing a full screen. Ray, just nod your head if we've got a full screen image there in our presentation. Okay, so I think we're ready to go with our program this morning. Now, this is really kind of a timely topic that I've got here this morning, and I guess I should say right off the bat, I'd like to apologize. It seems like every time I do a fruit program, we get a freeze event. So if you've looked at our calendar, I don't have any more fruit programs coming up here the rest of this spring. We might get into doing some other caneberries or something maybe when we get into midsummer or so. But hopefully, if I don't do any more fruit programs this spring, maybe we won't have any more frost or freeze events. And last night was probably going to take a pretty good toll on some of our fruit crops, but just because we get some frost damage or we lose fruit set because of the freeze, that doesn't stop our insect disease and pest control for the year. And so we're going to talk about some of those strategies for pest control. I want to give right off the bat a shout out to Dr. David Lockwood. I consider Dr. Lockwood a mentor, and I've told groups in the past, you know, my dad, I thought he was one of the best gardeners that I've ever been around, and that was his passion. I grew up on a farm, and when we'd work all day on the farm, my dad would come in of an evening, and all he wanted to do was work in his vegetable garden, his home orchard. Well, given to what he knew about fruits and vegetables, he always referred it to Dr. Lockwood as just the authority on information. And I really am appreciative that he's not only shared his knowledge over the year, but he shared a lot of the images and slides that I've got in this program for today. So we're going to start off with just some basics talking about the plant disease triangle. And I don't care if we're dealing with landscape ornamentals, or we're dealing with vegetable crops, or we're dealing with fruit crops. The plant disease triangle is the same for all of those. To have a disease show up in any of those plantings, we need three things. First, we need a host. And obviously, if we're growing fruit, those fruit crops are our host, or if it's vegetables, those are our host, or a landscape, those are our host plants. We have to have a pathogen. And anytime we generally run into a situation where we have a monoculture of similar plantings, same species, or maybe same cultivars, we run the risk of those pathogens showing up and exposing themselves to that host plant. But before we can be successful with that pathogen taking place on that host, we have the right environment. And anytime that we have a host, we have the pathogen, we have the correct environment, whatever that environment may be, whether it's wet and cool, or warm and wet, or dry, whatever the case may be, we can get consistent environment show up, and all three of those come together, then we're going to have disease. You know, we can only have disease exposure or pest problems when all three of those come together. And anytime that we come in and we remove one of those three, any one of those three, we're not going to have that pest problem show up. And so, you know, totally eliminating the pathogen is going to be a real challenge for all of us. And so most time I tell homeowners really don't ever consider trying to eliminate all pathogens, because that's really impossible. Now, we can easily eliminate the host, but we probably wouldn't have any fruit or vegetables or landscape plants if we did that. And obviously, we can alter the environment, but understand any time that we have disease problems in our home landscape, gardens, orchards, we have to have that disease triangle and all three of those factors coming together. Now, I want to talk about just a couple of definitions. We hear the terms signs and symptoms all the time. Well, a symptom is basically that plant's response to something that may be disease or pathogen or even environmental response. It's a growth pattern that we see something happening with that plant as a result of something else. And if we look to the right here, and we've got some apple blossoms right here, we've got symptoms going on. It's something's, as I use that term, ADR, ain't doing right. Something's not right with that apple tree plant. And when we start looking at it, we start seeing these leaf margins all burn up. The center of our blossoms kind of burnt. The pistils really brown. Well, what's happened? Is that disease? No, that's actually a weather event. And some of us, I know my apple trees are in full bloom right now. And after last night and probably tonight, I will see a lot of these. And depending upon the damage, it's going to really have an impact on what my overall fruit crop ends up looking like this year. And there's some things that we'll talk a little bit more about, symptoms and impacts of events like last night that can have on our plant. But symptoms are any of those things that we see that basically causes that plant to not do right, or something is going on wrong. Now we start thinking about signs. Signs are the actual part of the pathogen, such as galls or ooze or any mycelium or fruiting body structure. So in this image here, we got the blackberries, we can actually see a little bit of both. We can see some yellowing that's a symptom that something's not right. We can see some discoloration on the plants. We can see some cankers that would all be symptoms of something's going on. But if we zoomed in and took a microscope and looked very closely at these canes or maybe on these leaves, we could find these fruiting body spores of anthracnose. And so the actual fruiting body spores, though we may have to use sometimes a hand lens or a microscope, and sometimes we can see them with our naked eyes. But the actual signs of that disease and the true characteristic that tells us what's going on, we may need additional information. But all these spotting of the leaves and discolorations or canker lesions here lets us know there's some symptoms, and as we look closer, we can find the signs of what that actual disease pathogen is. Now, one thing about pest control, and this would be something that I would actually say for home landscapes that is the same. More often than not, I have homeowners come to me on a daily basis that want to know what to spray. I've got messages right here on my desk that people are asking for spray control programs. But the one thing that I would want to strongly encourage homeowners, that pest control is way beyond just spraying. You've got site selection and preparation. You've got cultivar selection. You've got the pruning, training, trellising. You've got your vineyard or orchard floor management. You've got harvest. You've got sanitation. And all these things that we'll actually talk about in this program to talk about controlling disease in our home orchards. And again, a lot of these principles I talk about are principles that we can apply to a home landscape, but today we're just targeting fruit production. Now, we start talking specifically about those management strategies, and I'm going to go back through it and cover a lot of those things we saw on the previous slide of breaking it down into cultural control, mechanical control, biological controls, and then lastly, the very last thing is going to be the actual use of pesticides and chemicals for controlling disease pressures or insect pressures. I've heard Dr. Lockwood say many times, the singular most important thing about controlling pest and disease, and a lot of times when I say pest, I'm even going to include wildlife. The single most important thing about controlling pest, insect, disease problems in a home orchard is going to be making certain that we do a good job in terms of our site selection. And with that site selection, we need to make certain that we find those sites that are appropriate for our fruit crops to grow. And so when we start looking at sites, and I've heard Dr. Lockwood say this many a time, when it comes to larger scale growing fruit, if you're a homeowner and says, I'd like to sell fruit at markets and things like that, that you're beyond just a few small fruit plantings for yourself. He always says, live where you farm, don't farm where you live. And the point of that being is that site selection is so important about growing those fruits in an environment where they can be successful. And so for our part of the world, when we start looking at an image like this, I want all of you to think about this image just like a grade card. And when we were in grade school, we all wanted A's. We didn't want any F's. And so when we look at this image, we look at A's and we look at A and B's. Those are definitely suitable type sites, but we want to stay away from the C's, the D's, and the F's. On my way into work this morning, just driving down the road and looking at the different frost patterns that settled on the landscape, on hillsides that were shaded or didn't get that early morning sun, I thought to myself, if we had fruit crops planted in those areas that we would think, that's kind of open, that's good, that's a good site for fruit crops, we could really set ourselves up for pest problems. And so when we start looking at these sites, we're going to be wanting these areas where we're going to get good air drainage off these sites, that we can capture some morning sunlight, but all that cold, dense air is going to drain off. Now, we want to avoid kind of some of these peaks, because like the weather event that we had last night, that's actually cold air masses blowing through. And any fruit crops that we might have had on these knolls that we would think, oh, that's going to get sun and it's going to get air drainage off that knoll, but it's also going to capture those really hard, cold blowing airs in, that's actually going to desiccate those plants and dry them out, and probably cause more freeze burn than what we would anticipate. These areas are like frost pockets. It's going to capture this cold air right here and not allow it to drain off, or down here, not going to allow that cold air to drain off. And then especially down here at the bottom, where all that cold, dense air may settle into that site and create those problems. So when you start looking at those, really put some thought into your site and location. Now, when we start thinking again more about that site and looking, we want to make certain that we get that sun, that all that cold, dense air can drain off. And so slope is going to be important. Now, that may not necessarily be the case for a vegetable garden, but when it comes to home fruit production, that's really going to be important for us to pay attention to. Now, a lot of the concepts that go into disease, specifically with home fruits or commercial fruits for that matter, and ornamentals, is going to be a concept of sunlight and airflow. One, sunlight's going to help basically thicken this leaf cuticle, okay? And a thicker leaf cuticle is going to make that plant leaf less susceptible to disease pressures. Airflow is actually going to dry those plants more quickly. And anytime that we have plants that stay wet for extended period of times, we create that environment where we open ourselves up for that risk of disease pathogens. I know some, like apple scab, I think they say if the apple tree stays wet for more than 12 hours, then you've got an environment that is acceptable to apple scab. So we want to put those plants in an area where, like this morning, sunlight's going to hit them quick, sunlight's going to dry them, wind's going to move through them, wind's going to dry those out, and then cold air is going to drain out. So other factors with that, increased flower bud production. So those trees or grapes or blueberries are going to be more fruitful. That's going to add to higher yields, and then also higher sugar content in those fruits And so they're going to be sweeter and just simply put, taste better. I also mentioned wildlife considerations. More often than not, I deal with homeowners that say, I've got these fruit trees and I'm going to put them in the back side of my landscape away from the house. Anytime that we butt those plantings up next to vegetation like what we see here in this screen, we open ourselves up for wildlife problems, whether it be deer moving through, grazing on those, or birds that happen to be nesting in the trees. And, the two birds look at each other and say, hey, look, great, we've got a food pantry that's opening up at the bottom of the tree. And so we want to make certain that we get those out away from that too. Structures like this are going to hold cold air in. We want to keep those away from vegetation as much as we can, or otherwise we may have to use structures like the electric fence that we see here, kind of in the background to protect these peaches. Variety selection, once we get past the actual site selection, which is number one, then we come into clearly the second most important category, and that's our variety selection. If you're 100% going to grow a fruit crop, the variety and cultivars is going to be the singular most important decision that you're going to make. And here, this is a couple of blackberries that I raised myself out of Primark 45, which is a primocane fruiting blackberry. So understanding what those cultivars are that offer the greatest amount of disease resistance. Now, there's all kinds of publications out there that talks about disease resistant varieties, and you'll probably see far more of them with apple trees than you will any of the other species, but they're out there. You may have to do just a little bit more digging to find those best cultivars. So you can use extension publications. I like recommending area growers. If you know somebody that's growing in the area, or particularly larger scale type growers, what trees do they have the least amount of problems with? Because they can be a good source. Obviously, we can use the internet, but if you use the internet, I'd still direct you back to using extension type sites, or at least looking at maybe growers that reputable growers that might provide information for those variety considerations. This is a publication here that Dr. Lockwood has done on selecting quality apples. It talks a little bit about some of the varieties that are offered. But there are others, and I mentioned this in terms of extension websites. Purdue University has a great publication that Jana Beckerman has produced that really talks about those apple cultivars and breaks down in detail which ones that are susceptible and which ones are non-susceptible for those major pathogens. And so I'd encourage you to really get online and check those out. And there's a multitude of those websites and publications just like this. If you're into like the caneberries, and by caneberries, I'm talking about blackberries and raspberries. We just refer to them now collectively as caneberries anymore. The University of Arkansas is the 800-pound gorilla when it comes to information regarding caneberry information. The University of Arkansas has got a lot of the varieties that have actually been developed. I think they're responsible for, some 30 some odd, 60 some odd different blackberry varieties. So check them out regarding that information. Any of these extension sites can be very useful in providing information for the homeowner. Now, if you're interested in grafting or making your own fruit plantings, I know a lot of times finding scion in the spring and February is pretty easy. Finding the rootstock to graft to can be a little bit more challenging. From time to time, different extension programs will offer that, or other gardening clubs may offer that service. But when you're doing that, really pay attention. Or if you order your own, typically that needs to be done in the fall of the year, late summer, very early fall to make certain that you get that rootstock in. And when you order that, not only paying attention to the size, but more importantly, what are those varieties resistant to? Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about mechanical control, and this is Dr. Lockwood here to the left that did a demonstration on talking about different methods of type of pruning on all apples, blackberries, blueberries, etc. When we start thinking about pruning, a lot of times as a homeowner, we think about just shaping trees and things like that. But really, there's a lot more that goes into pruning than just thinning or shaping of trees. An example that I've got out here right now is on a grapevine where we've actually done cane renewal. And we see the trunk of this grape that's come up here, and we see the trunks in the back here, where basically we have actually pruned out everything on this grape trunk with the exception of last year's canes that we identified as very healthy, clean canes that had good bud spacing on them. And we've taken everything out of that plant except for those two canes. Well, what's that do? Well, by eliminating a lot of this stuff that you see on the ground that we pruned out, we remove a lot of the disease pressures that will exist on that plant. So we can reduce the pressures of the disease we might have in that planting just by taking a lot of that material out. The same could be said for an apple tree. The same could be said for blueberries and others, but making certain that we're identifying those really healthy portions of that plant to perpetuate and removing all those disease or potential disease parts of that plant that may carry infection over into our growing season. So example here, we're talking about the caneberries again, thinning those out. And so in the illustration here on the left, I'm looking at those, which canes didn't grow very well last year. I may take them out. Which canes look like they may have some disease pressure? I'm going to take them out. Which canes look like they're really robust, very healthy, growing at a very fast clip? Those are the ones I'm going to save, and those are the ones I'm going to tip prune to actually do all my fruiting on. And then as a sanitation type measure, pruning those up about 18 inches off the ground. So from a food safety standpoint, I can improve food safety on those berries I harvest, but also getting those berries up off the ground where rain hitting and splashing doesn't really splash a lot of the disease that may be on the ground back up on that plant, and then perpetuating that disease over time. So old non-fruiting, one of the common things that I look in home blueberry crops as I go in and, they're like, how much do I prune out of this? And you'll see some of these old canes where there's really not much vegetation, not much in the way of fruiting. There might be 5 little berries on that plant, and yet we've not pruned those out. And so when you look at that planting and it's a very old, non-productive stem, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to prune that out. And both these right here, I may be taking those out if they are not very fruitful, and obviously by just looking at them, older. Some of these younger canes will be very fleshy and green, and they'll just, it doesn't take a lot to look at and say, that one's young and that one looks old and looks like it has issues. And later on the spring, when you're pruning those, you can just simply look at them, whether or not they're budding up to produce fruit, or if they have no buds whatsoever, taking them out. Now, when we talk about timing of pruning, timing is going to be pretty important from the standpoint of disease. We're not going to do any of that in the fall of the year. We're going to wait and do that all in the springtime. Now, apple trees, I typically prune mine in February or March. You may see some commercial orchards that may start earlier than that, but in those commercial orchards, they tend to have a lot of trees, and it takes a long time to go through and prune all those out. Other fruit crops, I'm going to wait later. And I'm going to primarily do that from a standpoint of frost protection, but also, like in the case here with grapes, by pruning later, I can reduce the pressures of canker diseases that might show up in those grapevines. And so I actually didn't even get my grapes finished pruned until early April. And with the weather events that we've had last night, if we don't have any more, I'll probably be okay on my grapes because I've cut those things back and they've really not come out and budded out like a lot of grapes that if I had pruned those back in, say, January. One, I may have set myself up for some canker diseases, but two, those grapes have probably already responded, come out, and probably got burnt back last night from the freeze event. Other kind of mechanical things that we can do, mulch. Now, there's certain times where we would want to use mulch to reduce pests, but there's also going to be times that we don't want to use mulch because it'll increase pests. If we think about apple trees, we really don't mulch under apple trees because that can increase the incidence of pine voles that may feed on the rootstock of those apples. Pine voles is a very, very problematic pest in commercial orchards, and that's why we keep bare soil out on the trees and that drip edge to keep the populations of pine voles down in those orchards. Now, on the other side, blueberries really respond well to mulch, and they really like that high organic matter. But even in mulch from that standpoint, one of the biggest problems with blueberries is an insect pest called the spotted winged Drosophila, or Drosophila suzuki. And when those spotted winged Drosophila lay eggs in blueberries, the little maggots will form, and if those blueberries drop off, those maggots can hatch out in that loose soil. They actually, where there's a little bit more moisture, a little more protection, they'll drop down and they're buried right there in the soil to kind of help them in that mulch. Well, there's been research done by University of Georgia about using black type fabrics or plastics under those blueberries. So when those berries drop off, those maggots really can't get down into the soil. We've got this hotter plastic material here that basically dries up those maggots and uses that as a method of controlling the overall pest population just through a cultural practice, a mechanical practice. Netting, if you've ever grown tart cherries here on the plateau, you probably understand the significance of what netting can do. I've had experiences myself. I know the first time I grew some tart cherries at the top of my driveway, and I come out one day and I was like, man, those things look great. I came home that night, every cherry on the tree was gone. And I was telling the story to my mother, and she's like, you think that's something? She said, I picked a pan of tart cherries out here off this tree, brought them in the house, washed them, cleaned them up, went back to pick another pan, and they were gone. And so we have to use some exclusion, or otherwise we can feed wildlife. So netting is going to be important. And if you're into, you say, I want to be as low spray. Now notice I didn't say no spray. If you want to be as low a spray as possible, then you may have to use some screening. And this, again, is particularly for spotted winged Drosophila to keep those from laying eggs in those maybe soft berries, whether it be blueberries or caneberries. And that's certainly an option as mechanical control of just excluding those insects from our fruit plantings. Now, shift to biological control. You know, biological control in orchards is not as effective as what we see in terms of vegetable gardens. And a lot of that is because we've got certain pests, and probably the biggest one I could think of right off the top of my head would be the codling moth, that, you know, you just about had to spray for it. And by spraying for it, we reduce some of those predatory insects that might feed on the codling moth. And research has kind of shown that if we try to build up that that predatory population, a lot of times the damage is so significant from the codling moth prior to those populations getting to where they can have any significant impact. But there has been research done. I think Washington State has done some looking at using pheromone dispensers to where they dispense a pheromone out and basically try to confuse the males during that mating season. We also see cases where more commonly we use pheromone type trapping as a monitoring system to make determinations from an integrated pest management system. Do we need to spray? Do we need to treat? And do we have that pest problem out there? And so here's a case where we've got the codling moth out here that we're monitoring. Okay, if you got a mic on, you might want to just cut your mic off down in that bottom corner a little bit. Pheromone traps to kind of monitor those. So we'll use those to look and monitor whether or not we've got that pest problem coming in. And maybe the biggest one, and I'll talk about this here in just a second, will be for blueberries. Now, one of the big things that we forget about a lot of times in terms of our pest management is just harvest. You know, it's critical that we harvest those plants and harvest those fruits. And if you tuned in to my program here a few weeks ago, so you want to grow fruit, one of the biggest things that I tried to hammer into people is, does that particular fruit schedule, mainly the harvest, fit your lifestyle schedule and traveling? Because one of the biggest and most significant things that we can do to either increase pest populations and disease or decrease pest populations and disease is going to be harvest management. Are you getting the fruit picked when the fruit needs to be picked? And so when we start looking at those harvest period times, and this is a slide that I brought in from the last publication, that, you know, this is a time frame when those fruits need to be harvested. And so we really can't put those off. And particularly when we start dealing with strawberries and raspberries, blackberries, those really soft skin type fruit, they're very perishable. And so their timeline, when it's time to harvest, it's time to harvest. You got to get them off. Now, with some of our apples and fruits like that, we might have a little bit more leeway, but notice that time schedule. When it's time to harvest, it's time to harvest. And those actually need to fit your lifestyle, or you need to make certain that you bring in troops to kind of help you get those fruit crops picked when they need to be picked. So really kind of that harvest management goes right into overall sanitation. And so if we're getting those fruit crops picked when they need to be picked, then that's going to be good. But if we leave these fruit crops rotting on the tree, that's where we're going to perpetuate a lot of disease. And so a lot of times when we get in that home orchard, we may have cases like this or black rot like this, where you're like, well, you know, that's not even worth harvesting. So I'm not going to do anything with it. I'm just going to leave it there. You know, whether you harvest this to throw in your wine bin, because you're not really going to make grapes off that, you still probably need to clip that, throw it in a tub, and then dispose of this cluster of grapes. Because all this is going to be a harbor for fruiting the spores. Think back to that blackberry cane that I showed you in the signs. Here are the symptoms of this. If we took a magnifying glass or a microscope and started looking, we could find the fruiting body spores of black rot here. So sanitation, keeping that orchard floor clean. And you notice under these grapes here, how we've gone in and we've sprayed. We've tried to keep the vegetation at a minimum. We're trying to expose that to the sun. We can control our voles. If we've got any fruit that does happen to crop, we can use that sun as a sterilization, hopefully to try and clean up as much as that of that as we can. Not a lot of vegetation here that we keep mowed, and keep it very clean and keep it very tidy. Now we look at an image like this, and a lot of people say, you know, but that is pretty. And it is a pretty image. But when we look at that image, are there potential problems or issues that can be seen in this this image? And from just a pure management and mechanical and cultural management of this orchard and trying to reduce disease pressure, I see things that I can do. And we've already talked just on the previous image, this bare spot underneath the trees, we could probably open that up a little bit more for vole control, clean that back and reduce the pressures of those pest type populations. But also even out here in the middle of these rows where we see all the dandelions. Now, am I going to come into this and spray because I see dandelions? No, but in an ideal world, I wouldn't want the dandelions there. And you say, now that's crazy. Why wouldn't you want the dandelions? Because that's for pollinators. Well, you know, if all this blooms on this tree doesn't entice or serve as a function for pollinators, I don't know how much more the dandelions are going to provide. But what will happen is if we do not do a good job of our harvest management, cleaning up, getting that diseased fruit out, if that diseased fruit falls to the ground to where it is rotting and perpetuating that disease, right here next to those dandelions, as rain comes in and splashes, when my pollinators work the dandelions and work the trees, I can carry disease back up into the canopy of that fruit crop. And so in an ideal situation, I would want that to be a non-pollinator type vegetation, whether it be wheat or rye or just a grass, fescue, not necessarily a blooming type plant that's going to have pollinators working the trees and working the floor and carrying disease back up into my plantings in an ideal situation. So lastly, we talk about all this management. And so if you're not doing those things, you're probably going to have some limited success with what you do with pesticide control. The image here is an old spray rig that my dad actually built. He took an old swirl cage fan, plumbed it with some nozzles, and then put a 50-gallon tank on here and motor, and we just air blast in. And what fruit we have, we've got approximately an acre that as a home orchard, and it still takes me probably about 2 hours to do all my fruit spraying because of the different fruits, different sprays, and so it can be very labor intense, even having the mechanization to speed it up. But you don't have to have that. You can have something as simple as a hand sprayer for small fruit plantings, and that's mostly what I'm going to recommend to homeowners. Now, good pesticide results depend especially, one, on the proper pesticide. You know, before you start spraying, have an understanding of what you're trying to use or what it is that you're using, and make certain that it has efficacy for that pest problem that you're trying to deal with. Spray at the proper rate. You know, the bullet down here at the bottom says, always read and follow the label directions. Well, the label is the law. And I can't tell you any different. To manufacture whatever they print on the label, that is the law that you're required to follow. So use the proper rate. One of the biggest common problems that I see with apple trees is homeowners that will take an all-in-one fruit tree spray. They think if a little does good, a lot will do better, and they over apply it. And in some of those all-in-one fruit tree sprays is a pesticide called carbaryl. And carbaryl is a very effective pesticide, But in commercial operations, carbaryl is used as a thinning agent. And we apply it at certain rates during certain sizes when apples are at a certain size to actually thin the apple crop. And if you over apply it, you can cause all apples to drop off. And I've seen many cases where homeowners have either used 7 carbaryl to kill insects on apple and caused all the apples to drop off, or they've used it in a combination with another spray and overused it, not following the guidelines, and caused all the apples to drop off. So proper rate is critical. And then correct timing. If you've heard me do any of my programs before, I talk often about revenge sprays. Revenge sprays are those sprays that make you feel better because you've sprayed it, but in the grand scheme of timing to control the insect or disease, you're way off target and all the damage has been done. And so avoid revenge sprays and make certain that you're using good, the correct timing on the spray. And then lastly, good coverage. And Dr. Lockwood will tell you that most times that he sees a pest problem and everybody's that they followed all these guidelines, it simply comes back they didn't get the coverage that they needed on the plant to provide that protection. So lack of control can be traced to poor timing, incorrect pesticide rate, or poor coverage. It's pretty simple. And so, you know, if you follow those guidelines and you're getting the right pesticide and you're following the right pesticide rate and you get good coverage, you'll get good control of those pest problems that you may be dealing with. So pest control strategies, there's a few of them. One is the preventative sprays. And most of the time, these are going to be predominantly used in diseases because we're using fungicides, and fungicides are barrier sprays. They are the equivalent of you putting on sunscreen and going out into the sun. Well, you're protected from the sun's ray, but hey, if you jump in the water and you swim around or you get out and get in the shower and wash off, you've removed that protective barrier and then it has to be reapplied. Same can be said for a fungicide. It is a barrier spray, a barrier protectant. It doesn't kill fungus. It just prevents fungus from penetrating that plant and causing its damage. There's also eradicate. Most of the time would be used in insects to where if we start seeing insect pressures, we're going to spray to try and kill and control those insects. Now, depending upon your level of maintenance and what you want to do, your economic threshold, you may look out there and say, well, I've got a pest, let the pest eat a few, that's fine with me, I'm not going to spray. If you're doing this for a living, like a lot of commercial orchards, one, as that pest starts to grow the population, lots of damage and lots of economic loss can be experienced from those, in which case we try to eradicate those pests. Now, for the homeowner, one of the best publications that we can offer is called the Disease and Insect Control in Home Fruit Plantings, publication 1622. This is a great publication that Dr. Lockwood put together in association with Dr. Boss and Karen Bell and others. A great publication that I encourage homeowners to utilize. It's very simple and straightforward and breaks down just the simple aspects of homeowners controlling disease and insect pests in their home. It's going to give you a listing of fungicides for each of those. On those are some of the organic fungicides that can be used for that particular homeowner. You've got copper, lime sulfur, and then just plain sulfur down here that classify as organic sprays, brand names that those may be sold under, and then the post-harvest interval. So how many days that you need to wait before you harvest those fruit. Now you notice most of these are 0 or there's no recommendation, but some of them may have recommendations as high as 66, 14 days, 50 days, 30 days. So depending upon what you're using, know what the recommendation is for the post-harvest interval. We have a listing of those insecticides that we'd use. There's carbaryl, or the brand name 7 down here, and we've got listed which are the organic insecticidal soap, which is a very effective insecticide for those soft body insects, as opposed to some of the carbaryl, which would be a traditional synthetic insecticide. Pyrethrins, which is made from chrysanthemums, can be classified as an organic, or the permethrin, which is also made from chrysanthemums, but is a synthetic version of that pesticide. And then spinosad. And I've asked Dr. Lockwood about this, and he really wasn't certain, but apparently at the time of the printing that the spinosad here was listed as a organic, whereas this version of spinosad, same products, was not listed as an organic. So all I can tell you in those cases, read the label, and label is the law. Now, when we start thinking about the timing, this may be a little bit of a shell shock or a little disappointment to some of you here when you start looking at this. If we're thinking about apple disease control, we're right here, probably middle to maybe the last 3/4 of the apple bloom. And we look what sprays should have already been put on our home orchards. Now, fire blight, I hope that you're trying to control it through cultivars that are resistant to fire blight, and you don't need to spray. Because controlling fire blight, that's a spray that's done during the bloom period on a 3 to 5 day interval with an antibiotic spray called streptomycin. These others, black rot, scab, those are all fungal disease, rust, powdery mildew. Those applications should have already been put on those trees. And then we're going to have, after the petal fall, what we call that first spray, and then cover sprays thereafter. And so the spray program starts early in the year. And if I was doing insect, that would have been out here as well with that dormant oil spray. So the spray program starts very early in the season, then continues on throughout that season. The publication breaks down all those different fruit crops to where you can kind of see at it an easy look. When do I spray? What material am I using? And why am I spraying this? What's it controlling? Well, with apples, one of the most important insect sprays I tell homeowners that they can make is this delayed dormant spray with an oil emulsion plus copper. Get you right off the bat in terms of controlling those scale and crawling insects, and also any of these fungal diseases right off the bat. And then bud break for scab control, which can be a problem in orchard. Here's your cedar apple rust, and then fire blight with streptomycin on through. Now, later in that season, and I've kind of underlined here, malathion insecticide for the plum curculio, codling moth, and other insects that might be growing for the season. And you'll see there's also down at the bottom of the page that there's footnotes that you can look to, for important statements about using those pesticides or timing. Any one of these links, if you go online, you can just follow the links to get additional information or publications regarding that specific topic. Pear is going to be just like an apple, whether it's an Asian or European pear. About the only real difference when it comes to disease control in pears, there's not much that's labeled for homeowner use. You're basically limited to copper, sulfur, and streptomycin. From a management standpoint, apple is near the top of management requirements. My highest is going to be our next fruit, peach, with pear, and then apple, and then down the line. Peach is one that here on the plateau, just from a weather standpoint, from a disease pressure standpoint, it's going to be your most maintenance and management intensive crops. And it's one that I typically steer homeowners away from unless they're hardcore serious about trying to grow fruit. And if you're like me, I'm about to the point where I just about as soon cut my peach trees down just because of the intense spray schedule I have to manage, the thinning of the crop, and just general maintenance of those peach. They're bigger to grow here on the plateau. There's some footnotes in here, and again, we've already mentioned sanitation, but some of these, like brown rot, is one of the biggest problems with peaches that we're going to deal with. And there's that sanitation creeping up. Man, we've got to keep our orchard clean, or we're going to really deal with problems with brown rot, and it's a booger to control. We also have some borer insects that can affect peaches, as well as some of our laurel trees that might be in our landscape. And if we're not really kind of treating those, we may bring those into our landscapes as well. And it lists out those insecticides that we can be using to treat those diseases and pests. As we start getting into grapes, again, we're kind of stepping down the peach at the top, pear, apple, then I'd lump grape in there as my next in terms of controlling. The big one for grapes is going to be black rot. And if I had $1, Ray, for every homeowner that's come in the office, and you might be with me there as well, that had grapes that were rotting on the vine and says, how do I control this? And it's black rot. And I'm saying, that should have been started when the shoots were 4 to 6 inches long, and repeating on through that growing season to control that black rot. I generally like to start out with something like mancozeb. Mancozeb has a very long post-harvest interval, so it's one I'm going to use early in the growing season. I can't use it all later in the season, and I'm going to switch off maybe to Immunox. But if you notice, even Immunox has a post-harvest interval of 14 days. So before you harvest those, you got to back what can I be applying? What's a post-harvest interval for that? And there's a publication that talks about black rot if you want more information on that. Strawberries, again, getting easier, a little easier, less things to control, not as much stuff that I'm going to use to control. Malathion got for strawberries. Some plantings, it's not this, but in strawberries, a 3-day post-harvest interval, controlling spittle bugs and aphids and things like that. One of the common things, or fairly common, that I'll see in strawberries will be slugs, and using metaldehyde to control slugs in those plantings. But not a lot of stuff that we need to do with berries. Strawberries is going to come back a lot to just cultural management and renovating those, and reducing disease pressure, and then rotating sites to reduce disease pressure. So mechanical, cultural type practices more so than just spray practices. And then blueberries. If I had to pick one, and years ago when I first started here in Extension in Cumberland County, and people came to me and says, I want to grow fruit, bang, blueberries is going to be what I recommend here on the plateau. And it still is one of the easiest crops to grow that we have. And if you get your pH right here on the plateau, and you don't drown it, you get it planted, man, it'll do remarkably well. And it's one that really doesn't require much spray. And if you look at our spray guide, there's really nothing that we're recommending to spray for blueberries. Now, the exception to that is if you have the spotted wing Drosophila Suzuki. And we're going to encourage you to use bait trapping type stations here. We've just taken a cup with a lid on it. We've drilled these very small holes, and you can find this information on extension websites talking about trapping stations for spotted wing Drosophila. And we're going to bait this with either a apple cider vinegar, or we may use a bait scent that is going to be some type of fermented type product that you can actually purchase. And in the vinegar, we might put a little bit of dish detergent, so when those insects come in, they get in this water, and we can actually monitor and see how much of a fly population, one, are we even catching the Drosophila? And if we are, what kind of numbers? And that's going to tell us whether or not we need to spray, because when it comes to spotted wing Drosophila, you're talking about a teeny tiny fruit fly. We're either going to have to use a fine mesh screen to keep them out of our plantings, or you're going to have to spray. Or you can have maggots growing, fly larva eggs or maggots in your blueberries. We can use spinosad or other sprays to control those, but again, it's a regular spray to control those insects on blueberries. And other than that, really not a lot of pest problems. Now there are some canker diseases and things, but I still refer people back to more cultural, mechanical practices than I do spray practices at home blueberries. Blackberries and raspberries. So blueberries and blackberries, raspberries, strawberries, they're down here at the bottom of the list. There's way big difference between the management strategies for them as compared to grapes, apples, certainly peaches and pears. So with these blackberries and raspberries, not a lot that that is listed for homeowner use. Copper for controlling some of those blackberry diseases, Immunox as well. And so, other than disease, not a lot of pest problems with those. The insecticidal soap that I've got mentioned down here again can be very effective in terms of controlling those soft body insects. Insecticidal soap works if you think about you using a harsh dish detergent. Okay, so harsh dish detergent will dry and crack your hands, makes them sore. Well, these commercial insecticidal soaps, and I'd encourage you to use an off-the-shelf insecticidal soap as opposed to trying to manufacture your own detergent to spray. Just buy an insecticidal soap because they're specifically designed and follow the label for using that insecticidal soap for the best efficacy. Can do a really nice job of controlling those soft-bodied insects on whether it be fruit, vegetable, or landscape plants. As I've tried to emphasize all throughout this program, successful pest control is far more than just going out and spraying. And so if we're going to grow home fruit or home vegetables or in our landscape, we need to think beyond just spraying to solve a problem. We need to think about the site selection and really preparing that site and having it ready to go for those plants. We need to make certain that we're putting the right plant in the right place. And in this particular case, dealing with those fruit varieties that are either hardy to the zone or hardy to the disease pressures that it might experience. Trellising, training, and pruning, all those things reduce they enable us to do a lot better job in terms of spray control. They enable us to do a lot better job in terms of lessening the pruning impacts. And so all of them go hand in hand in doing a better job of managing that fruit crop. Vineyard floor management, keeping the weeds out or not at least growed up to a point, reducing rodents that may be in there. Timely harvest, sanitation, and then again, lastly, the thing that I tell people is a spray control program for your home fruits. And with that, that finishes our timely topics for this morning. And at this time, I know some of you are probably sitting out there. Billy may be on the front row that's saying, hey, Mr. Upchurch, may I be excused by